Hello, everyone. My name is Adam Waldeck. I'd like to thank you all for joining Nebraskans for Workers' Rights tonight for this special telephone town hall with Newt Gingrich, former Speaker of the House and General Chairman of American Solutions. We'll be discussing the union-backed card check legislation that would effectively eliminate the private ballot in union elections. And we'll also be discussing the important role that your Senator, Ben Nelson, has in this debate and the eventual vote. If anyone on the call tonight would like to ask a question, all you have to do is hit *3, and you'll be put in the queue to ask a question. And with that, I'm going to turn this phone call over to Newt Gingrich.
This is Newt Gingrich, and I want to thank each and every one of you for joining us tonight, because I think this is really, really an important opportunity for all of us to talk about something which is very, very important to America. Let me say, first of all, that I think that we all have to thank Nebraskans for Worker Rights and State Treasurer Shane Osborne for putting together a Nebraska-run organization, because Shane really recognized that the key to this is to allow folks in Nebraska to have a say about how Nebraska should be represented in the United States Senate. Senator Ben Nelson plays a key role in all this, and we have great respect for him, and we recognize that he is going to be right at the heart of these decisions, and you can have a role in communicating with him about what needs to be said and done in order to make sure that Nebraskans have their voice heard in Washington. The reason this is so important is that we have had just a runaway congressional situation this year with $787 billion in extra supplemental spending in the so-called stimulus, which has clearly not worked. Also, we've had a clear problem just 2 weeks ago in the House, where they had a energy tax that passed that's enormous, that would cost virtually every American several $1,000s and dramatically cripple the economy. And we're seeing this pattern where bills suddenly come up, people vote on them, they don't know exactly what's involved, and as a result, things are getting through that would not get through if the American people knew exactly what the issues were and exactly what was involved. We are very concerned that at the last possible minute, maybe on a Friday afternoon, Senator Harry Reid is going to get up and say that he is going to bring up the following Tuesday the so-called card check legislation. And I want to report to you exactly what that is. Card check legislation is really a very misleading term. It is a bill which would do two very profound things. First, it would eliminate the right to vote in a secret ballot in a way which is very, very important. What happens in a company where somebody might want to try to organize a union is people go around and they get cards signed. And after they get 50% plus one that are validated, they then have a debate, and then they have an election. Now, the fact is that when they have the election, very often the workers, once they've had the issues presented, once they've seen the cost of paying the union, once they've been involved in a conversation about what's at stake, often vote by 70 or 75% no, even though 50% had voted to have the election. The union leadership, having lost a number of these elections, has decided that it will simply eliminate the secret ballot election and instead go to a process in which the union leadership will collect cards, and the minute 50% plus one have been collected, in effect, that is the election. Now, why does that matter? It matters because if you have an open process of gathering names, you can very easily end up in a situation where so much social pressure is brought to bear that, in fact, people end up signing something they don't want to sign. You know, once the union leadership figures out they need so many cards, and they get the first 20 or 30% from people who really do want to join a union, then they get the next 10 or 12% from people who are willing to do it just out of friendship, and then they're down to the last couple hundred, and they have paid full-time organizers. and those organizers visit you at church, and they visit you at the grocery store, and they visit you at the bowling alley, and they come and knock on your door, and one afternoon you go, well, just to get rid of them, I'm going to sign the card. And then all of a sudden you find out that was the vote. Now, originally in the 1930s, when they passed the National Labor Relations Act, the unions themselves asked for the secret ballot because they did not want workers to be pressured by the businesses. Now, you have an exact reversal, because it turns out that in the modern era, with the current economic conditions, people don't want to raise the cost of their job, and people don't want to pay the extra dues, and so they've been voting no. So the first thing that's at stake in card check legislation is the very core issue of whether or not every American worker should have the right to a private ballot where they get to decide whether or not they will, in fact, vote yes or no, in private, with no pressure, with no one looking over the shoulder. The second part of the bill is equally bad, if not worse, and that's a provision that says if you haven't completed your negotiations in a relatively short time, the government will step in, the government will decide, and the government will dictate the terms of employment. It is literally eliminating the right to argue over your contract, and it runs a very real danger that the government will dictate the hours, the salaries, and the conditions under which people are required to work. It's a remarkable provision, and it is designed to have the unions be able to find government arbitrators who favor the unions, who will then insist on the kind of deal that the unions want. For both of these reasons, the card check legislation is very, very dangerous. The key vote in the Senate is not on final passage. We're all very confident, Nelson, on final passage we'll vote no. But the key vote in the Senate is on a process called cloture, the question of whether or not the Senate will, in fact, cut off debate, eliminate any chance of talking it to death, and force a vote. And that's the key vote because it takes 60 votes to close down debate. It only takes 51 votes, or 50 votes plus the vice president, to pass a bill. And so there's a much higher mountain to climb if the issue is that of whether or not to cut off debate. And that's the key thing. We need to get a commitment from Senator Nelson that he will stand with Iowa, with people in Nebraska, with people in Iowa, with people in North and South Dakota. He'll stand with all the folks who are in right-to-work states where people have decided in their own right that they do not want to be forced into a union. They do not want compulsory unionization. This is a very important vote across the Midwest. It's a vote about jobs, and that's the last thing I want to comment on. We've had 9.5% unemployment. Yesterday, the Federal Reserve Board announced that it thinks that the unemployment rate will go to at least 10% or more, and it announced that it believes it's possible we will have a recovery with no jobs, and that for the next 5 years, there will be no net new jobs. That's not me talking. I'm a historian. I'm not an economist. That's what the Federal Reserve has said. I think that's very sobering. And I think we've got to get back to real economic growth. And here at American Solutions, we're working very hard to get real economic growth. And yet, in that kind of economy, with that threat to our jobs and to our country, it is estimated that this card check legislation would kill 600,000 jobs in the first year alone. So I think it's very important for us to remember that Nebraskans have always defended workers' rights. Nebraskans believe in the right to have a private vote. Nebraskans believe that you should not be forced to work under a contract you didn't negotiate. And Nebraskans want more jobs, not fewer jobs. So for all of those reasons, I think it's very, very important to talk with Senator Nelson and to convince him that a no vote on cloture, as well as a no vote on final passage, is vital to the future of America.